What if Britain had won the American War of Independence? The American colonies would have remained in the British Empire, at least for the time being. Perhaps the colonies would have reconciled themselves to a restoration of British control, and gradually have moved towards greater home rule and eventual independence, in the same manner as many countries in the later British Commonwealth. But it's equally likely that the rebellion might have flared up again in a few years, or the British government might have taken the view that it was far too expensive to maintain a large army of occupation in the conquered colonies, and de facto independence would have been granted. Is it likely that victory for Britain would have merely delayed American independence? Or could the US still be part of the Commonwealth today, like Canada? Either one is possible. Benjamin Franklin thought that independence would come naturally. He anticipated something like the British Commonwealth. He thought it would be impossible when the American population was far greater than the population of England, for the government of America to continue to be administered in London. Franklin thought America's population would surpass that of Great Britain by the middle of the 19th century, and he based his calculation on natural increase alone. When immigration is factored in, America was certain to have had a far larger population by 1850.1. Don't see how London could have avoided extending far greater autonomy to the Americans over the course of the 19th century. What might have become of the 13 colonies post-war had Britain been victorious, as well as revolutionary leaders like George Washington? The leaders of the rebellion might well have been treated in the same manner as the leaders of the rebellion of 1745-6 in Scotland, who were executed for treason. If Franklin is to be believed, the British public was enraged toward the colonists at the time the war broke out. Years of war only stoked those passions. Had the rebellion been crushed, retribution would have been the order of the day. Some leaders would have been executed, some imprisoned for long terms, and the colonists likely would have had to pay fines or faced some sort of economic punishment. And what do you think would have happened to the rest of America beyond the 13 colonies? The French Revolution might have been America's opening for attempting once again to gain independence. But assuming that had not been the case, I think London would have continued pushing towards the west. It almost certainly would have taken the British longer to reach the Pacific than it took the United States. British merchants looked askance at settlements beyond the Appalachian barrier, but Britain would have gotten there eventually. Spain claimed the territory west of the Mississippi River but hardly controlled it. Britain probably would have kept the Native Americans of the Ohio Valley and the territory that is now Alabama and Mississippi as they were trading partners. This might have stymied the spread of American settlers to the west. Then again, it might not have, as the Royal Proclamation of 1763 had not done so. The real impetus for American settlement of the Great Plains, the area between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains, much of it wrested from Mexico in the mid-19th century, was to connect the East Coast with the West. In the 1840s, the United States and Britain nearly went to war over what is today British Columbia, in Canada. 5440 or fight was James K. Polk's campaign slogan in 1844 before he became the youth U.S. president. Britain, with its naval superiority, would have controlled the American West Coast. Spain would have been squeezed out. It's not clear if Mexico or the other Latin American countries would have developed in the same way, had there not been an independent United States and North America. What benefits or disadvantages might victory have brought Britain? The benefits, if such they were, would have taken the form of greater economic control of the colonies, and especially of their overseas trade, which was subject to the restrictions of the 17th century English Navigation Acts. But that advantage was unlikely to have been very much greater than the British reaped from defeat. The independent United States remained in a semi-colonial economic relationship with Britain for many years after 1783. consuming vast quantities of British manufactured goods and sending to Britain enormous quantities of raw materials. Had the British won the war, they would have been burdened by the costs of governing and defending America. So we can say that defeat left Britain with many of the benefits but few of the costs of empire. A great challenge would have been to somehow win back the hearts of the colonists. It would not have been easy. A victorious America largely hated the British for a century after the Revolution. Hatred would have lingered longer and burned more deeply in a defeated America. How might nations, other than Britain and the US, have been affected if the war had gone the other way? France, Spain, and Native Americans would have been most notably affected. France supported the Americans, but primarily as a way to weaken Britain and protect France's West Indian colonies. Would the French Revolution have happened without the successful example of the American Revolution or the huge debt France incurred by participating in it? Granted, France was reeling from an ineffective government overladen with aristocracy and political inefficiency and the defeat in the 7 Years' War. Spain was fortifying its Mexican borders in the 1770s and 1780s. Its main interest in the war in America was to get back Gibraltar. The Native Americans were the big losers in the war, though. The British were their allies, though allies the British sold out when it served their interests. I'm not singling out the British for doing this, as most nations tend to seek their own self-interest. The British had proposed an Indian buffer state in the Ohio Valley, and they were trading partners with the Iroquois, Creek, and Cherokee tribes, one reason they supported the British rather than the Americans. Could a one-nation unification with Canada have been on the cards for North America? The Americans tried to conquer Canada in 1775 and wanted it ceded to the United States in the peace negotiations of 1782-3. But the British were determined to keep Canada, which was now increasingly gaining the Protestant population British governments had wanted since 1763. Thanks to the exodus of American loyalists from the US. If America had lost, then the loyalists may have stayed in the old British colonies, leaving Canada overwhelmingly Francophone and Catholic, in which case it would have remained very different from the rest of the mainland British colonies. One think Britain would have opposed unification, at least for a very long time after it crushed the American Rebellion. During the 7 Years' War, it had sought to keep the 13 colonies from unifying under one government, as Franklin had proposed in his Albany Plan of Union. Had it defeated the colonists in the Revolutionary War, Britain might have divided some colonies low, keep them weak. Furthermore, the changes it sought to impose in Massachusetts government in the coercive acts in 1775 probably would have been the rule of thumb in every colony. Do you think Australia would have still been developed as a penal colony if the 13 American colonies had remained under British control? New South Wales in Australia was established as a penal colony. But if the North American colonies had remained British, there would have been less incentive to ship convicts so far. America was the cheaper option by a long way. Incidentally, the idea of imprisonment and reformation of convicts would have suffered a blow, as it was the end of transportation to the American colonies that provided an opportunity for reformers who argued that criminals should be incarcerated and improved rather than executed or exported. More broadly, we can say that the loss of America saw a shift in British imperial focus towards the East, especially Asia. This so-called swing to the East has perhaps been exaggerated, but there was undoubtedly a recalibration of imperial priorities. That said, expansion in India had already started and would probably have continued, though not perhaps at the same pace. Probably, Britain's real colonial interests in the 1770s were not America but India, Jamaica, and Barbados. And so Britain wanted control of sea routes to India and also direct trade with China. Australia would be useful to both. If Britain had retained control of America, how might this have impacted 20th century events like WW1? If we assume that the British had won the war, and the colonies had remained subject to the British crown, they would no doubt have entered World War I in the same manner as the British dominions in 1914. Whether that would have tilted the balance in favor of the Allies and against Germany, Austria-Hungary is impossible too. Say maybe a still dependent America would not have industrialized so quickly and its population would have been smaller, with the result that the addition of strength was nowhere near as great as it was in 1917-18 when they actually entered WW1. My understanding is that Britain made a concerted effort to smooth relations with the US, beginning around 1890, which proved helpful during World War I. How that war would have been seen in an America that was tied to Britain as colonies or in a Commonwealth arrangement is difficult to know. Canada did not need any prodding to back London in 1914. However, there was a deep strain of resentment in America in 1776. One can find it in Thomas Paine and Benjamin Franklin, of the colonies having been dragged repeatedly into that old rotten state's plundering wars. Franklin? Such a sentiment might only have hardened over time, and, as for many in Ireland, a European war might have been the spark for many Americans to rise up in favor of breaking away from Britain.